Dumb.
Stupid.
Crazy. Dangerous.
Stinks.
Yes, Saved by the Bell. That's from the Lincoln Project, using that program's characters. And by the way, there's a reboot coming. And they're calling out the Trumpiest of Republicans who spread the election fraud lies that infuriated Trump supporters in the lead up to the Capitol Hill riot. As we know, hate groups like the Proud Boys and QAnon, they were out in force storming the Capitol that day. But now they're focused and dejected in the aftermath. The Times, they've been tracking the Proud Boys' internet chatter, and those folks are complaining that Trump actually left office and had the temerity to disavow the riot, even though it was tepid at best and days later. QAnon, they're confused and they feel abandoned. And in the meantime, the Republican Party, it is in tatters, with the MAGA lawmakers battling the ones who are trying to move past Donald Trump. And now a blast from the past is speaking out. James Comey, the FBI head who was fired by the president because the agency was investigating his campaign's ties to Russia. Well, Comey's now talking about Trump and his Republican Party, which Comey left, by the way, to become an independent. Comey says the GOP, quote, needs to be burned down or changed, as at its core, it is built on lies and racism thanks to Donald Trump. He also spoke about the attack on the Capitol, saying, quote, it's our own Chernobyl when the ugly radioactive violence and racism of America explodes in public view. I want to bring in my guest, Denver Riggleman. He is a former Republican congressman from Virginia who's now forming an intelligence group focusing on domestic terror. Congressman, thank you very much for the time. And I want to talk about your latest efforts and what we saw on the 6th in a moment. But first, about your party. And for folks who don't know your backstory, because you officiated, as I understand it, a same-sex wedding, your own state party in Virginia basically moved to have you basically taken out of the party. And even though your family had real losses because of COVID, you were replaced by somebody who denies its very even existence and rails against the idea of even wearing masks. What has it been like seeing what's happened to your party and how it's impacted you just over the last 4 years?
And first, thanks for having me on. And, bringing that back up, a lot of people sort of scoffed at the notion when I really started to rail against QAnon quite some time ago. I was very alone, but I actually saw it during my sort of church parking lot convention here in Virginia. It's a little odd. But I saw it then, and I was accused, because of a same-sex wedding, I was accused of being funded by George Soros and trying to change the sexual orientation of children. And some of the other things they said were so bizarre, I wondered where it was coming from. And since my background is disinformation and counterterrorism, 2 decades, I looked into it. So I started really seeing QAnon type of conspiracy theories and language back in 2019, Richard. So and by early 2020, as you know, I was just railing against this kind of ridiculousness in the party and saying it could lead to violence. And at that point, most people scoffed me and said because of my intelligence background, I was too paranoid. And sadly, maybe I wasn't even paranoid enough about what was going on in the party.
2 really good friends to this program, former Republican Congressman Rick Lazio and Chris Shays, they seemingly have lacked, at this point, hope that the party's going to come back to them. And they reminded me that Reince Priebus, before he was ever the chief of staff of the president, he was the author of that postmortem in 2012 that said, listen, we got to be more inclusive as a party here because we can't just be with the angry white guys. And then look at his metamorphosis. I guess my question is, there's an opportunity now. Mitch McConnell apparently is telling people close to him, reports are, that he wants Trump gone and convicted. Former staffers of Trump are telling people on the Hill they should convict. And we're seeing resignations from staffers of sitting congressmen and women on the Republican side because they think their bosses, are on the wrong side of history. Which side of history do you think Republican senators are going to take in a couple weeks here or so when they're actually going to vote on impeachment?
Well, your question's fantastic because right now I think some of the senators are going to pick getting reelected. And I think you're seeing that in the House also. That's what they're choosing at this point. And I've had a tough time staying in the Republican Party. And, my biggest thing looking at this is I was never a politician when I got in here. I've had a very short, political run. But what do you do at this point when you have a party where you want it to be big tent? And I was screaming about having a big tent party, and it turns into a carnival tent. When you're bringing in QAnon, I think they misunderstood me, Richard, right? And, it's just amazing to me when you see other congressional leaders or former Republicans that served in the House or become independent have called me and said, Denver, what are you going to do? You'd be a fantastic candidate as a Republican in another era. But at this point, you're really not fitting in. Are you going to run independent? What are you going to do? And looking at the senators in the House, I guess I wish I was more optimistic. I think we can maybe try to fix it, but I don't see, Richard, where it's going to be very difficult to get the 17 over the 50 for conviction in the Senate. I think in the House, when you see that 147 total voted to object to the electors, they know their districts. Some of them are leaning that way. And in the latest poll, what was it? 79% still believe in the Republican Party that the election was stolen based on stop the steal conspiracy theories. This is unprecedented. You had a siege of the Capitol based on fantasy. They could have sieged on something like thinking there were unicorns in the basement. It wouldn't have been any different than the ridiculousness that they sieged the Capitol on. And that's the problem we have, is how do we get back to ideas and policy and away from this sort of authoritarian conspiracy theory type of issues that you see in the Republican Party right now?
I'm curious. I know 10 Republicans in the House, they voted for impeachment. I'm told that if it was a secret ballot, 150 of them would have voted with them. I'm talking just Republicans would have joined them. You buy that? Because I hear McCarthy, he says one thing one day and then the next day he says something else. And to me at least, I don't put him in the category that I would, let's say a Boebert or a Marjorie Greene or one of these people who I don't know where they're from. In some ways, it's worse because he knows better. Down deep, do they believe the QAnons are the crazies? In a million years, they wouldn't associate with them, but because of politics? Or do they actually agree with some of this craziness that the election was stolen, et cetera?
Well, I think there's going to be three things that happen, right? I think in 2022, and I know this is going to surprise you, but just looking at what's happening now, I think you're going to see a lot of Republicans running on election integrity and stop the steal. It's going to happen. Also, I thought the most that were leaning was between 10 and 40, and maybe 70 that wanted to do it at the max, that would be very afraid to do so, but believed it. I don't think it's 150. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the composition of some of these districts. I mean, if you're in an R+30 district that went for Trump at 75 to 80%, you take an 80% cut of that and you're in trouble, if you go against this ridiculousness. And I just believe there's a courage factor here. I think people need to step up and say these are facts. As you know, I started a company, another one. This is my third DoD company. My background was Air Force intelligence, but I think we need some kind of Center for Disinformation Defense that's looking at these sort of radicalized ideas. And obviously, we can't censor everybody. We don't want to do that. But I think we do need an aggregated data group that looks at this and says, hey, here's where the falsehoods are. There's where they're coming from. And we need a baseline training and education program from high school through the universities. And that's where I'm at. And but again, you're right. I just don't think it was 150. And there might be some other individuals that say that. But I was in Congress. I was just there 3 weeks ago. I was an active congressman. And I would humbly submit that number is way too high at this point.
Denver Riggleman, I really appreciate the time, Congressman. Thank you so much.
Richard, I appreciate you. Thank you, sir.
All right, folks, when we come back, we will pivot to COVID, and we'll be joined by an ER doctor in California. He's going to discuss the outbreak and when we could finally start to see this subside, plus issues with the vaccine. When will it get to you? And much more.